You know, Warren Harding and John Kennedy are the only people who've gone directly from the Senate. But one of the great ironies is Gerald Ford, who was a child of the Congress, who loved Capitol Hill, who always regarded the House as his real home in Washington. There's no doubt about that. And who cherished his friendships. The remarkable thing is he found himself in a position where for 2.5 years he was called upon, in his estimation, to defend the prerogatives of the executive branch, which were dissolving like sugar in water in the wake of Richard Nixon and Watergate. And part of it was in terms of domestic spending, and part of it obviously was in terms of foreign policy. And indeed, without getting too topical, you can draw a direct line between Dick Cheney, who is the chief of staff, the youngest chief of staff in American history, who saw all this going on, and who, in my opinion, came to nurture a lifelong, passionate belief that the presidency was somehow in danger of being permanently eroded. And, well, we all know how that turned out. So, no one's done it since. You know, Gerald Ford paid a price for bucking convention. One of my favorite stories is the 1975 State of the Union address. He got up and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the State of the Union is not good." No one's ever tried that since then either. Yeah.
Did President Ford ever express a particular reaction to the Watergate tape that struck you?
I think he was genuinely shocked at the language. I think he was genuinely shocked, and you could call him naive, that Richard Nixon lied to him. Yeah.
What about President Ford's response, his feelings about Ronald Reagan, especially after August of 1976?
Well, I think it's in some ways it's complicated, in some ways it's very simple. And I don't want to prejudice you. When you read Tom DeFrank's book, there's a good deal there about this. And Tom's a good friend, and Tom loved the president. And you can decide for yourself. My view is that I think Tom exaggerates the resentment that Ford felt. Because I had a few conversations, and Gerald Ford just wasn't the kind of guy to waste time holding a grudge. Now, if you asked him, did Ronald Reagan campaign for you in the fall of 1976 as much as he might have? You know, he was going to say, hell no. But, you know, if you ask certain questions, you know you can push the button and you know what kind of response you're going to get. And to be fair to Tom, he makes it crystal clear that the moment that the President and Mrs. Ford learned about President Reagan's diagnosis of Alzheimer's, they were crushed. He said it was one of the saddest days of his life, and whatever, you know, latent, you know, lingering resentment may have existed, you know, disappeared. He visited President Reagan a couple times in his office at Century City, and the first time they had a great conversation. The second time was, you know, further along in the course of the disease, and he really wasn't sure. He didn't recognize him at first, and then he sort of gently coaxed him along, and you know, brought up a few names from the past and joint experiences, and you know, he thought he did recognize him, but it was a wrenching experience for Ford to go through, and I know their hearts went out to Mrs. Reagan. I mean, throughout that period and to the time of the president's death. Yeah.
Cheney and Rumsfeld were important in the Ford administration, and they're important in the present administration, and Ford had an opportunity to observe them in the present administration. Did he ever say anything about that, or his attitudes toward them change?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I'm very old-fashioned in some ways. I actually think there are private conversations that are private conversations. And I don't want you to read anything into that. I will tell you this. his personal affection for both men never wavered. Really, to the end of his life. He was really an admirer of both men and very grateful. And they were, it must be said, no reason for you to know, but they were, I mean, I saw Dick Cheney at an event about 2 weeks after the funeral. And I said, you know, Mr. Vice President, first of all, I apologize because I'd only just then seen a tape of the service at Grace. And I realized then, which I didn't at the time, you're in a fog when you're doing things like that, that as I came down, he said something to me and tried to speak to me, and I just walked by. But I apologized. I said, you know, I just want to say to you, this is a town you know better than anyone. This is a town where people have very short memories, you know, and gratitude doesn't last very long. And I've always been struck over all of these years by how much you've gone out of your way, you know, publicly and in many, many ways that the public won't ever know, privately, to support the President Ford, to enhance his legacy, you know, to be there. And, you know, and he didn't have to do any of that. So on that personal level, I can tell you the friendship never wavered. It has, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you haven't read in the press. There were stories that the President was perplexed by the Iraq War, and in particular by the rationales that were cited originally for going to war, and then in particular the whole issue of weapons of mass destruction. And it's not a secret that he thought that that was not an acceptable rationale, although that didn't mean that he disagreed with other rationales. But Gerald Ford was a conservative, small c, conservative. And that meant, in my opinion, sort of a West Michigan conservative, someone who has a healthy skepticism about remaking the world overnight, about bringing perfection and ushering a utopia. That's for other people, you know? That's not for healthy skepticism, not cynicism, because he was perfectly willing throughout his career to employ government, for example, in a number of ways to try to right injustice and provide economic opportunity. But I think particularly when it came to foreign policy, maybe particularly because he had fought in World War II, I think a president, every president, including the current president, if they lie awake at night about worrying about anything, it's about sending young men and women into battle. And I think Ford, coming out of the Vietnam War, was even more cautious. And I think that experience branded him for life. He had seen what had happened when America went into a war for reasons that may or may not, frankly, have been true. And what happened when the government lost its credibility and ultimately its moral authority, without which there can be no authority. And he had been there at the end, and the humiliation of sitting in the Oval Office, watching, as he said, the United States get kicked out of Southeast Asia. And I think for those reasons, if for none others, he would look very, very carefully before committing U.S. forces in a cause such as Iraq. He was, by the way, very supportive of the first Gulf War, totally supportive.